Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe and hit the notification bell. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter, Telegram, and Locals, and Facebook. And you can support me on Locals, Subscribe Star, Buy Me a Coffee, and make sure to also check out my Substack, which is another place where you can get my content. For now, every month, one article will be free, and the rest will be behind the paywall, at least for this year, and probably next year they'll all be behind the paywall. So, this is something, episode 44 of our casual stream. Logos and I have been talking about doing this for quite some time. He has a real knack for coming up with philosophical thought experiments. And I thought we have a lot to work with. It'd be really fun to go through. So why don't you go ahead and introduce us, Logos?
Yeah, so I've been talking about this for probably over a year and talking about philosophy of mind stuff. And philosophy of mind is pretty complicated because there's positions within positions within positions. So if you're a dualist, you might think that there's like a non-physical causal mechanism that interacts with your brain to produce the things that you do. If you're a physicalist, you might think that only the brain does things. But your commitment to, say, physicalism could be various extremes. You could believe that there's some kind of like a causal foundation for what the brain allows you to do. You can believe that, in the extreme sense, that only facts that can be stated in some future physics will be left standing. So we can knock out all sorts of things like choice or consent or qualia. Not that they won't exist, but whatever is being described by the terms we're using now will be fully collapsible in these other terms. And so even just like the physicalist dualist distinctions, you've got like bajillions of camps. And so I'm not going to take a position on any of that because it's way too complicated. That you'd like 10 streams to do that, not one or two. But I've come with some thought experiments that I use to kind of clarify some things on philosophy of mind, and Todd's found them kind of cool. And so we're just going to, I guess, share them today. So I typed them up, and we'll see how many typos we can find as we go through them.
All right, there we go.
All right, so let's see here. Where is my present button? There should be important. You'd think I know how to use this, but I never actually do presentations when I do my thing. You know what? I'll find it later. In the meantime, we'll just keep going. So we got the title page. All right, so when I make thought experiments for philosophy, here are my rules. Play slideshow. There it is. Look at that. Look at that. There we go. Okay, so thought experiments attempting to show something false or unlikely shouldn't assume situations which beg the question against the thing being critiqued. So a good example of that might be I've heard of some possible world thought experiments levied at physicalists that construct possibilities, which, if they'd accept as possibilities, would just get them to admit that physicalism is false. And so, of course, they're just not going to accept the possibilities. And we've all heard some thought experiments where just like, why would the target of this experiment, believe that? So I want to avoid that in mind. Rule number 2, thought experiment worlds should be worlds that the belief under investigation could see themselves being in. Basically an extension of one, right? I want more than just to say this isn't making the question. It's like, can you imagine living here if your belief system came to fruition in like 5 decades and solved all its problems? And then from 1 and 2, my goal is to show some further tension in other beliefs, even assuming the plausibility of this world we've constructed. And you'll see how this thought experiment does it in various ways. Nowhere am I going to... So a lot of these are going to aim themselves at physicalism, and we'll talk about kind of why and how and what I mean by that a little later. But the idea is, the goal here isn't going to be to show the whole physicalist project is false. It's too big. One experiment or two can't even do that. My goal here is to say, maybe there's some things this project hasn't considered in situations where, even if it's true, there's still things unconsidered that we should consider. So these are very light thought experiments. And they're also designed, I should have said this, they're also designed that people can see them and take a lot of different things out of them. Some people say use thought experiments like arguments with a single conclusion that you must take from the experiment. I prefer things that are more open-ended, that generate discussion rather than like, here's the conclusion, this is what you should get out of this thing. Okay, so without further ado, I guess we can move on. So the philosophical view under investigation is reductive physicalism, which is extremely hard to pin down. There's a Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy article I can link in a comment later on. And a good quote in the article, I think, is a good starting point that says, physicalism is an attitude one takes to form one's ontology completely and solely according to what physics says exists. Well, I'll interpret that in a minute. Now, why I think this quote's a good starting place is because there have been more formal ways to state it involving if and only ifs, involving sentences and physical facts and things like that. There's like two different kinds the article goes over, and there have been problems with those particular expressions. And so for our purposes, instead of trying to like nail down a particular expression of physicalism or anything like that, um, it'll just be more interesting to investigate the broader attitude to see if there's something more in the attitude rather than like a particular like propositional statement of the idea. Um, okay, so the definition talks about an ontology. What do you admit into your ontology? An ontology is like a catalog for what kinds of things you take to exist, what those things are made of, and how they interact with one another. So, for a simple example of this, Todd and I in a recent Church Father stream, we talked about the question of angels in Justin the Martyr. And Justin said some things both of us kind of scratched our heads over, and it turned out that he had to say them because in his ontology, God and physical material always exist. Angels aren't, so God creates everything ex materia. Angels aren't the results of physical kinds of things given where they are with respect to God and so on. And so Justin says, well, if this is the physical material dichotomy, angels are equivalent to like manifestations of God's energies in Eastern Orthodox rather than like things of like with wills of their own. And so in there we have a really complex discussion of like what are angels made out of? How do they interact with reality and how do they interact with God and so on and so forth. So very complex theological questions can boil down to these questions of ontology. Now, some people are probably listening to this explanation going, yeah, I know. Some people aren't up to philosophical jargon. So I figured I'd add this in just to bridge the gap if people are interested. Okay. So to translate that statement from Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, basically you can say it like this. A physicalist attitude is an attitude which says that the only things that exist are the kinds of things which could be under the purview of physics. And I carefully worded that because of Hempel's dilemma. There's a Stanford Encyclopedia article talking about Hempel's dilemma and physicalism. Basically, it's a question of like, what do you mean by physicalism is expressible in terms of physics? Because current physics can't address the the brain question completely. Like neuroscience isn't a closed or complete field, surely. But on the other hand, if you want to say that physicalism is reduces talk of brains down to what future physics says, you end up with an interesting begging question of like, well, are you going to kind of commandeer physics to kind of to be the thing that would only be allowed to talk in terms of brains, or are you going to leave future physics open? Because if future physics is open, maybe it goes in a direction you wouldn't predict, and you admit all sorts of entities that you wouldn't think of right now. But if you leave it closed, well, then what that's just saying is you have a commitment to closing future physics off to certain things in virtue of others. It's a complicated thing. And so rather than talking about what physics says or what future physics says, I'm talking about like a broad category of things which could kind of be physical things that physicists care about in very wishy-washy terms to not try to navigate that. I'll leave them to navigate Hempel's dilemma and those kinds of questions. And you should read articles that explain it better because I just no way can I in this intro. Okay. So note that the broad thing I'm looking at here is reductive physicalism, but the quotes I talked about physicalism. Like I said earlier on, they're very different things. So physicalism is just a very broad idea that just says whenever we're talking about brains, we're talking about conscious experiences, we're talking about making choices, tastes, etc. What you want to do is start with facts of the brain and kind of work outwards. Now, you can have a physicalism that starts from the brain, works outwards, and doesn't stop. And so you can get all sorts of interesting things like emergentism and other types of physicalisms that allow much more interesting causal mechanisms and stuff. A reductive physicalism, I take, is to be a type of physicalism that is a this and only this. So you can describe it using these physical kinds of statements and only these kinds of physical statements. So the reductive physicalism I'm taking to be and the only physical statements kind. This is the kind that I'm going to be targeting with the thought experiments. Is it true that all the relevant stuff about brains, consciousness, personhood, and so on are only describable in terms of physical statements? Another explanation I've written up here is basically there are also two types of reductive physicalism, broadly speaking, that you could be as well. So you could be a semantic reductionist, where if you say any sentence about like, see what pizza tastes like for you, or what you want to be when you grow up in terms of like free will and personhood or something, a reductive physicalist would take those sentences and see if they can make a series of substitutions to end up kind of about, statements about chemical brain states at the current time the statements are being made. Um, there are kind of non-reductive physicalists that wouldn't go that far, but they'd still go pretty far, and they would say that like, well, the person says that, and maybe the person has beliefs that they'd say that, and those beliefs are existing things, but those beliefs are kind of grounded by. So even if the beliefs might not be fully physical things themselves, they're grounded by a bunch of physical processes which um, kind of underpin them like a foundation. So here's what the brain of the kid's like that might make him think this is a good idea based on his past experiences and so on. But the sum of the child might be greater than the sum of its physical parts. So it's really complicated. So that's why what I want to emphasize is what I said verbally about the only physical facts version of physicalism, which is what I really want to highlight with these experiments. Yeah, basically I talked about that before the slide, but here's a slide for the audience to also read in parallel with what I've said. Okay, so let's get to the thought experiments. And before I do you want to jump in with any questions or anything like that, Todd?
No, I think this is, again, we have talked about this a lot privately, and yeah, the of the three types of physicalism, right? You said there's the reductive kind, which we're most familiar with because it's the majority amongst the sciences. Think of like the new atheists. And then you think you said there were two kinds of non-reductive. One was a kind of emergentism, and I forget the third.
There's probably lots of different kinds of reductive and non-reductive. So what I said before was um, there's two types of reductive, which would be sufficient explanation reductive and semantic reductive. So semantic reductive means you can like substitute every part of a sentence involving qualia, personhood, so on, into purely physical components, and it will be literally the same sentence without substitutes. A lot of physicalists think that's too strong, but what they would say is there is a physical explanation for a sufficient, in the sense of like Leibniz, like a very strong, sufficient explanation of physical stuff for everything you're saying, even if you can't semantically make the same substitution. Examples they'd give for that would be like Clark Kent and Superman, right? So not everybody knows that Clark Kent is Superman, and so they wouldn't know they could, in all cases, substitute Clark Kent and Superman in the same sentences. But the explanatory people would say that the causal explanation for there being a Clark Kent is that he is Superman, whether they know it completely or not, or whether it makes sense to substitute the sentences or not. And so they're both kind of reductionists. Clark Kent is reducible to the being that is also Superman, but there's kind of like an interplay on how strong you can make substitutions going on there.
Okay.
Yeah, the non-reductive types are really interesting bag. The ones I'm most familiar with are darn it, the word escaped me. The one that I just said, the emergentist. There it is. That's one type that I'm really strongly familiar with. I wish I was familiar with more of them. But honestly, I haven't dipped my toe into this thing to figure out like the full web of who's arguing with who about what yet. So okay. So thought experiments. So these again are very general things that I use to kind of like navigate philosophy of mind things. So when I see a view, I go, I think about these things with the experiments and say, how does this view strike me in intuition based on, these things I'm thinking about, and go from there. So here's the first one. So this one focuses on ethics and personhood. So the goal of this thought experiment is to get the people that think like all stuff about the brain is only true insofar as it's stuff regarding like physical theories and models and causality and whatnot. And it's to juxtapose that with like ethical questions about the brain, even if it were true that we could physically model everything about people. So let's think of a person named Mary, right? She's a woman named Mary. And Mary is who I'm going to use all the time because of Mary's room. It's a little tongue-in-cheek thing, Okay, so there's this person named Mary. She's been repeatedly propositioned by some guy named Dan, who's kind of a creep. And she keeps rejecting him. Every time she goes to the bar, he's always hitting on her. She rejects him. Now, let's suppose in this world, like I say above, we have so much physical mastery over the brain that we can make these love potions. So, today we might talk about like slipping somebody a roofie or something to knock them unconscious and do bad things. But let's suppose we have so much mastery over the anatomy of the brain and personhood that we could slip somebody a love potion or drink that when they drink it, will orient their brain so much they'll fall madly in love with you completely, forever. You've oriented their brain chemistry permanently to like you when they didn't before. Much more nefarious version, right? So Dan gets frustrated after all these rejections, and he slips a love potion into Mary's drink. It's a very expensive one that would do more than, make her amenable to him for just that night. He wants her forever, right? So he paid top money for this one. This isn't some bargain bin love potion. Okay, so what happens to Mary? Well, there's two things that could happen. So the first thing, suppose Mary's friends see her leaving with Dan, and they catch her. They catch her and stop it. She'd never leave with Dan. Why is she leaving with Dan? They're like, something's wrong. We're going to grab her and take her to the hospital, even if she resists because she wants to go with Dan. They take her to the hospital, and they basically are able to, using their technology, take a previous scan of Mary's brain, get her in a chair and like zap her or something and undo all the chemical stuff that Dan has done. They get her back. Now, Mary, understandably, after this, she gets back into her brain. She's like, what happened? She wakes up in this hospital chair, and her friends are like, yeah, you tried to go with Dan. He slipped you a love potion. And she's mad about it. She wants to press charges on Dan, right? Now, I think a lot of people hearing this story might agree with that. Of course, Mary should press charges against. He literally tried to like alter her mind to do untoward things to her, right? That's a very common like ethical intuition. Here's what should happen. Now, the issue with this is that if only true statements about the brain are those modelable by physics, what I want everybody to keep in mind here is that physical statements are purely descriptive. All they can describe is what Mary's brain is physically like at some point in time. So physically speaking, Mary's brain was like some way. At a later time, because of some physical substance she ingested, it became like another way, right? And you can fully model those physical equations, you can fully do all this stuff, and then physics is basically done. That's it. You fully describe the transformation from Mary's brain from state A to state B. Well, but the question is, if Mary wants to press charges on Dan for the change in her brain state, right? What this seems to convey to me, and I hope to everybody else, although there are lots of ways you can take the thought experiment, is that there's some oughtness about Mary's brain. There's some identity, right? So I am Mary, and this physical brain state I have at this time is the one I'm supposed to have. It's wrong for somebody to change it. Now, that's not something that you're going to find attached to physics, any sort of physical stuff. I wouldn't see something like, here's the state of water at time t, and it would be wrong should somebody boil it, for example, right? And so what we have is an extra ontological class of physical states. There's a difference between a physical state like water, which can be boiled or frozen or whatever, and whatever's in our brains that makes it wrong to change one, but not wrong to change the other one. Let's keep going. Whoops. No, go backwards. You're supposed to go backwards. It's not like we do that backwards. Okay. So let's keep talking here. So I guess we're not done yet. So the point is, let me catch up here for a second. Sorry. Yeah, that's the issue. So there's this different ontological category of physical states, but this category cannot be found in the physical states themselves. And that would seem to me to violate the only clause that the physicalism I'm targeting here would want to have. The only true things we can say about what's going on are that which is in the physical systems describable by the physics. But if we want to attach this distinction in ontological categories, we've gone beyond the physics to do it. So let's stop there for a second. What do you think about that, Todd?
Yeah. So what the horns of the dilemma appears to be is either A, you're tempting the reductive physicalist to go with his intuition and say that yes, her friends should have been involved in an intervention, even though at the time she was in the chemical states of who she was wanting to go with Dan.
Exactly.
But then the problem is that intuition is not consistent with the physicalist position because they have to appeal to something over and above the mere mental description of her mind at time t going out with Dan.
Yep. They have to say there's some way her mind ought to be, and it's currently in the state of not being the way it ought to be.
One of the things that this reminds me of, because we're talking about was something wrong done here, right? Because a physicalist, to be consistent, would have to say no, just like there's nothing wrong with boiling water.
Right.
This sounds very similar to the problem that I proposed to Stefan Kinsella with the mule. I said, look, if the mule, the science fiction villain from Isaac Asimov's Foundation trilogy, mind controls you, then he has the objective link to your body. He's not an aggressor because the objective link is the precondition to determine ownership and aggression in the first place.
Right.
It sounds like it's using a similar intuition that I used in that argument.
Yeah.
Because what you're saying is, well, no, you're assuming something immoral happened, but remember, this is a precondition for something immoral or moral to happen, and you're not allowed to do that based on your philosophy.
Yes.
I like that.
Okay, so it gets worse, right? This assumes best case scenario where they actually find what's going. They figure out what's happening to Mary. They catch her. They undo the damage quickly before anything permanent can happen to Mary or the relationship or whatever. So the next thing to consider is thought experiment B or part B of this experiment. What if they don't catch her, right? Suppose they never went with her to the bar that night.
Real quick, if you go to the slideshow, does it just go to where you're at now?
I think so.
Click, you're on B, so click on slideshow.
Yeah, there we go. Yep, I only did it to go backwards. There we go. Okay, so suppose Mary's friends never went with her. Dan slipped to the potion, and they romantically and spontaneously decided to leave the country. Right? It was a good potion. Mary wasn't found by her friends for another 5 years. They had searched the globe for her, literally. At which point, she's now married to Dan and has, children with him. While they could reverse Mary's brain to a backup state she had prior to entering the bar, what would losing 5 years of maturity do to her if we did? What would it do to the children? Finally, at what point would we say that reversing new Mary would be tantamount to killing a person who has existed for X years? See, this is now I added this part in and presented it this way for a good reason, right? So, when you talk to physicalists, I talk to some who have the physicalist attitude on my Discord server and stuff, yeah, and what they want to say is, yeah, I've got no principled reason for wanting laws against this sort of mind control stuff. But socially speaking, we can look at the consequences and make kind of like a consequentialist argument against this kind of stuff because X, Y, and Z. It's like, okay. Now, what's interesting about adding this extra layer to the thought experiment, especially in concerns to, like, say, restitution. Now we're in a real pickle because what does restitution look like here? If you revert Mary back to her old self, then this Mary, who's existed in what was Mary's brain for 5 years, is a distinct person, right? Remember, persons are kind of sufficiently explained or semantically reducible or what have you, down to whatever is physically true of their brains over the duration. So there has been a person, let's call her new Mary, living in Mary for 5 years with these physical properties. If you were to get rid of her at this point, it will be terminating the existence of a person, their brain states, who has existed for 5 years. It would be like committing murder to provide restitution for a crime.
Real quick, does that mean that Dan committed murder the first time?
That's what I asked. That's actually what I asked right here. So if legally Mary cannot be reversed, at the very bottom paragraph, can Dan be charged with murdering old Mary? Why or why not? Exactly. And this is important because one thing physicalists will say is like, well, just because we're physicalists and think that, people are reducible to the physical objects doesn't mean that, like, say, murder shouldn't be illegal, right? So if you want to be really glib against the physicalists, what you could say is the difference between a living body and a dead one is just a few chemical properties about the brain and its relationship to, say, oxygen consumption or something. Right? Like you could make that kind of argument. The physicalists are going to say, well, of course not. Of course not. They're really, useful. They're kind of nominalistic, right? Just because they're all chemical states doesn't mean they're all chemical states that are equally useful to us, right? So it's useful to us to describe the difference between dead states of living people and alive and dead people, in order to make laws that you say shouldn't kill people. But what this does is it puts them in a really interesting predicament where currently old Mary is dead by their definition. The physical state in her brain that was her no longer exists. It's been killed in the same way that old Mary would have just been deprived of oxygen or something, right? Like consider two cases. Let's suppose that old Mary was, like, murdered. Dan took some of her DNA, made a clone of her, altered the brain of the clone at that point, and ran off with the clone, right? Old Mary would be dead in the same way that she is now, except, there's one more dead body. There's a difference in physical material, but realistically speaking, the same things happened. But if we were to take her away from Dan and her kids, this new Mary that's existed for 5 years and doesn't know any different, we would basically be doing the exact thing. It would almost be like as if we killed the clone physically, resuscitated the old Mary using some miraculous scientific technology, some Asimov stuff or whatnot, right? She's back with her old brain states. The clone's now dead. It's very similar to that sort of thing having happened from a personhood perspective. And so we have this major contention. We now have this question of what person ought to reside in this object we'll all refer to as Mary's brain.
Well, here's the thing, though, right? What
Yeah.
if we just also imagine, slightly modify what you said about Dan? He doesn't actually kill the first Mary. He just puts her under for a while to draw some DNA to clone her. They're
She's like
going
a
to have the
secret
same
cryo lab in the
bodies, but
basement or
different
something.
mind states.
Exactly. Yep.
So what does that mean?
It's a good question.
Because you'd have Mary and the clone of Mary, but the clone of Mary's mental state loves Dan, but the original Mary doesn't. But they're genetically identical.
Yeah, they're genetically identical, but they would be distinct in the brain states, in the fact that one Mary contingently has a brain states that involve her loving Dan, and the other one didn't, which is why she's in a cryo lab in Dan's basement or something.
Right. Well, I mean, I think what you'd have to say to be consistent is either one of two things. You'd either have to say that Dan and Mary's friends are both charged with murder, or you'd have to say that neither of the two are.
Yep.
Neither of which is really very satisfying, because if you say that if they go through with this, then both Dan and her friends are charged with murder, and it's like, well, why are her friends? Because they're trying to help her, but they're doing exactly the same thing that would have got Dan convicted. And
Exactly.
so if you don't want her friends to be charged with murder, then you're going to have to say, well, neither can Dan. And
Right.
and then you have to ask yourself all over again, did anything wrong happen?
Exactly. Yeah. If you want some anti-symmetry in what's going on here, then you have to have a principle that would allow the anti-symmetry. It is not wrong for her friends to Mary 5 years later what Dan did, because now, again, whatever because you use there cannot be described purely in terms of the physical states, because we can all agree that the physical states of Mary's brain living with Dan are exactly as the physicalist describes. Like, you just suppose, for sake of argument, you just list them all out. There they are. There's all the physical states describing her brain. Here's all the physical states describing her brain before. We have the before, we have the after. But we need some anti-symmetry in why they ought to be A and not B.
But as they're fond of telling us, you can't derive an ought from an is.
You can't. Exactly.
And the other thing, too, is the same group of people, of whom I had a lot of online engagement with, are also prone to utilitarian arguments. So I would argue that, according to this subset, new atheists fall into this absolutely, you shouldn't do it, because what about the children?
That's a good question. What about the children?
What about the children? Because now we're going to be all consequentialist utilitarians. I mean, that's basically the whole point of Sam Harris, his book about scientific morality. Well, okay, well then it's obviously going to cause more harm to the children. And, since there's, you use the plural, so there's at least two. Now we have two, if not more, people at stake than just the one Mary. So, the greatest good for the greatest number logos, those kids outweigh the good of Mary.
Yeah, like something's weird here. And here's the thing. I'm not saying that any particular philosophical or ethical system has the silver bullet solution to the problem. Don't get that twisted at all. What I'm trying to say is, if you take a physicalist view of mind that's so extreme that once you've described the physics that happen at time 1 and time 2, and that's all we need to say about the brain, we're kind of done. Like, you just don't have the language for even trying to solve the problem. And in fact, it'd be difficult to figure out what problem there is to solve, because all you've done is describe the things you're supposed to describe, and that's that. But if it seems like there is a concept of what it is like to be Mary, or what it is to be Mary, that goes above and beyond the brain states, now we've got some work to do. We would think, for example, that her friends are justified in rescuing her from the clutches of Dan and putting her brain back the way it was. If we think there is something it is to be Mary that is over and above her current brain states, while she's under Dan's love potion spell.
Yeah. So again, this is a really subtle thought experiment here, like you said. It's not to. It's the primary aim is not to say that physicalism is false, but that physicalism can't identify this as a problem, which itself is a problem because we all intuitively know it to be a problem.
Right. It's just meant to cause kind of a tension or uneasiness in the reader if they're looking at it from the perspective of a physicalist. It's not meant to be like a knockdown against their theory or model. It can't do that.
Because as you said, other models might struggle with this as well, but the other models might at least be able to recognize this as a question and have some higher order reasoning to appeal to. So presumably a non-reductive physicalist might have an easier time with this.
Exactly. Yeah. Or at least, understanding why it's a difficult question. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, there we go. Okay. So my takeaways from the experiment, right? So for me, and I encourage everyone else to take something different from it. I'm not making a particular argument. Stress that again. Can't stress it enough. What this shows is that even given the world physicalism promises us, there will still be odd questions about chemical states in the brain that will not be purely answered in terms of the physics, those chemical states and so on. And I didn't think about this when I was typing it up today to present it, but the way it is, what it is to be an X question. So it's interesting because you know more about this than I do. Like Thomas Nagel, I think his name was, the what is like to be a bat question. So much of the philosophy of mind questions are about the what it is like to be a bat, or what it is like to be depressed, or what it is like to see red or to taste pizza, whatever. They focus on the what is like questions an awful lot. And I think an insight I've gained from this thought experiment, because every time I think about it, I glean new things from it, is the new question I think which should be discussed more, and probably is, I just don't know the literature, is what is it to be question? If what it is to be Mary is to be a set of chemical reactions, then currently Mary is dead and there's a new person that occupies where she's spatiotemporally occupied, I guess. If to be Mary is to be a set of chemical stuff in the brain and some odd property of the chemical stuff, then it becomes a bit more of a robust question. So I don't know. I hope to hear or see more what is it to be vernacular in these debates, more than just the what is it like to be in these debates. So
real quick, Logos, sure. Shakespeare beats you on that one. To be or not to be, that is the question, Hamlet.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I'm not saying I'm original. Like
no, but I'm just saying we through literature and philosophy, we have understood the importance of this question.
Yes, absolutely. And I think recently for this topic, it's fallen away, and people they're focusing on very particular things like qualia and not focusing on like the totality of being personhood, I guess is the best way I can put it.
Yeah.
Well, there we go. So I think the second paragraph, the audience can read, but it's basically what I've already said. So I don't want to belabor the point. Let's see if we can fit one more thought experiment in.
No, I think we can.
Let's do it. Okay, so this thought experiment, I like this one even more than the first one because it's less depressing. And I also really, really like reading about Gettier cases. So it just pushes all the buttons for me. I love it. So this one's all about knowledge and epistemology. And we'll talk a bit more about that later. But epistemology is the study of like, what do we mean when we say we know things? Do people who say they know things really know things? Can we be mistaken about things we think we know? Should we have said that we knew them in the first place if we were wrong? Or, should we have been more tepid about what we were saying? That sort of stuff. When does the word know make sense? Okay, so let's suppose we live in the same physicalist utopia as thought experiment 1. Suppose we coincidentally have another woman named Mary who is married to a man named John. On his way home from work, John is approached by a game show saying that he has won a free vacation to Mexico for 2 weeks and the equivalent of $10 million, provided that he doesn't tell Mary about it until he gets home. It's just a prank, bro. Little does John know that this game show is also a front for the CIA, one of their undercover agents needs to go into hiding due to their cover being blown. Let's call him Tim. Tim looks almost exactly like John. Like you probably couldn't tell him apart without a microscope or something. Further, let's suppose our secret communications technology the government has that will give John's DNA whenever Tim's is tested, and give John's brain states whenever Tim's brain states are tested. So remember, we live in physicalist utopia. If we can alter brain states with carefully crafted love potions, we can scan them to see what they're like now, what they should have been like in the past, and so on. So the idea here is whenever whenever some attempt is made to scan Tim's brain, there's a receiver on John down in Mexico that will just immediately send John signals back to Tim, and they will see John's brain states instead of Tim's. I could make a bunch of other stipulations too. Suppose Tim gets dental work done to be identical to John. Suppose, think about all the ways in which they could subtly end up being different and this whole thing could fall apart. And just suppose those are all accounted for. We're in like a highly futuristic society with a whole bunch of technology. Like, just sweep it under the rug for a second. Okay, so Tim comes home to Mary, pretending he's John getting home from work. Okay, John's now in Mexico. He's getting that game show money and a couple week vacation. Why not? Mary quickly notices that there's something off. Tim could study some of John's behavior, but he can't get it perfectly. He's not literally John. And so Mary starts getting concerned. She tests his DNA. She tests the brain state. She tests everything she could test under like a physicalist worldview to see, is this my husband? And every time, because of this advanced government communication technology, all the results just come back, yeah, it's John. What are you worried about? Now, suppose Mary is viewed as crazy for believing her husband is an imposter. After doing all these tests, she still doesn't believe it. Something's still wrong. This is not my husband, whatever. And she could either be institutionalized or given a little something, some kind of a magic potion, to convince her that Tim is really her husband, John, at least for the few weeks where John is in Mexico until the swap can be remade, right? Now, before we get to the takeaways for this, what I want to go over is a TLDR version of some discussion about knowledge. I can't give everything. Again, the literature is way too vast, but here's a good starting place. So in epistemology, knowledge is usually defined by justified true belief plus something else, or JTB plus. The plus comes in due to something called Gettier cases, and I highly recommend you just go look up Gettier cases because they're just fun, fascinating little things to read. They just make you question a lot of things. I like them. So I had a plus condition at the end for those. So justified. What does that mean? Well, did Mary have some reason for thinking Tim wasn't her husband? Mannerisms, habits, etc., or was she just like guessing on a whim, right? If she had some reason observing Tim's behavior for thinking, hey, something's not right, that would serve as her justification. She's not unjustified. She's not guessing. She's not throwing darts at a dartboard. This is something she's observing and reasoning herself into. Now, was Mary's belief that her husband wasn't Tim true? Yeah, her husband's John. He's in Mexico. This is a replacement. Okay, so her belief is true. Now, did Mary believe it? Can anyone doubt it in this experiment? I would say no. That's why she got him tested in the first place. And if she continues believing it, even in light of the tests, which one might believe she does, to the point of being institutionalized or whatever, nobody can doubt that she sincerely holds the belief that these aren't the same people. Another plus condition. So there's lots of different plus conditions you could use to address Gettier cases. They all have pros and cons. My favorite is, was there some fact which, if Mary had known that fact, would have undermined her justification for her beliefs? And this fixes a lot of Gettier cases, but might come with its own problems. And I would say no, there is no fact like that, right? Because if Mary had access to other facts, like the government was intercepting all of her abilities to test Tim's DNA and get the accurate response, she would have figured out, sooner. She wouldn't have been wrong. So, according to this particular JTB plus scheme of knowledge, we could say that Mary really does know that Tim isn't her husband. John is, who's in Mexico. So, once I get to that, so here's the takeaways. These are pretty quick. So, it seems to me that Mary could have sufficient knowledge about the fact that Tim wasn't John, not because of information related to John's brain states, but rather in spite of false information to the contrary. Now, physicalists could say the differences between John's and Tim's mannerisms could be explained by difference in John's or Tim's brain chemistry. That's true. Obviously, they're different people, so, it's a trivial truth. They'd have different brain states. My point is it plausible that Mary wouldn't know what they are, the brain states, right? So what brain states in John produce which mannerisms in John? So if you look at a mannerism in Tim, could you go to the doctor and like physically cut open his head and like figure out like, what's different about this brain that should be there in John that's making these mannerisms? Like, I don't think Mary would have access to that information. I don't think most people in that society would have access to that information. I mean, we know a ton about biology, genetics, and so on, but most people go about their day-to-day lives and just don't know most of it. So I could believe that Mary's one of those people here. Is it plausible that Mary couldn't associate Tim's actions with the differences in A, even if she knew them, right? if she could look at the physical brain differences in both and say, here's what would explain their differences, um, is she able to associate them anyway? No, because every time she tries to look in Tim's head, regardless, the government's blocking her and sending her information about John to begin with. So even if she was smart enough to figure out an A, she was getting blocked from applying that information in B. Is it plausible that Mary knows something is off about John despite her inability to appeal to A or B? Yeah, I mean, I would think so. I think most married people intuitively would get the idea that if some imposter just swapped for their wife or husband in an emergency, they'd kind of figure out something's up. Now, if these are true, this means that brain states are at best a necessary explanation rather than a sufficient one. So let me give more about that real quick, and then I'll hand it over to you, Todd. So sufficient versus necessary. Like a sufficient explanation would mean Mary knows John's and Tim's brain states, and that's how she knows they're different, right? So if brain state differences, then people differences. That's using brain states as a sufficient explanation for why they're different. But in this case, what we have is a necessary explanation. Mary knows John and Tim are different. And so a trivial consequence for Mary would be that, yeah, if this isn't my husband, it's somebody with a different brain, owing to the physicalist point. But I'm not using the differences in the brain to find out that they're different. I'm using something else about what it is like to know John. Let's put it that way. What is like to know John instead of to be John? That's a problem here. There's a problem in what it's like to know John that Tim isn't solving that makes me think there would be a difference in people and hence a difference in brain states. And that's what's fueling the knowledge, not these physical facts, which should be sufficient to know all the differences.
Right. Well, one of the things that I want to bring up is, since this is a knowledge question, there's a couple ways that one can acquire knowledge. Like, so I like to use this example, right? You have a woodsman who, for any sufficiently trained amount of time out in the wilderness, you could in theory get good enough to like read the environment and, survive and track and everything like that. But if we imagine two men like that, but one has what we might call a sixth sense and the other doesn't, and this guy knows that he has this, whenever he gets this feeling, usually means he's being watched by a predator, even if he can't see the predator. So he just gets out, and right. it just always works. And the other guy doesn't have that. And so while he's really good, he can't see the predator, and he doesn't have that sixth sense, he gets attacked. The one could have the kind of knowledge of the first woodsman with this sixth sense, and Mary could just know right out of the gate that something's wrong.
Yep.
What that would see, because we know that kind of knowledge exists. We can imagine it in other contexts, right? So nothing about the mere description of the material forest, nothing about the mere description of this man's training can fully explain why he has this sixth sense, but he does.
Mm-hmm.
So in one case, you could say that Mary has that sixth sense, and that's it. Now, that's one that would the physicalist would be more likely to dismiss as her being crazy. But then you said, well, what if she actually has some good reason, like noticing a difference in behavior or something else like that? Then the question is, yeah. But you see, I guess where they would want to object then is they would say, well, what they would want to say is there could be no difference if they were already that identical to begin with. But that's a claim that would be very difficult to sustain.
Right. I mean, yeah, they are very, very different people. I mean, John is just some guy that happens to look like some CIA agent that needs to get undercover for a minute and, hide. So, I mean, the idea that they'd be like identical twins or something, and that's what's going on here. It's just like, no. I mean, it's very believable that there'd be some differences in behavior. What's really interesting is, I think I'm gonna get this in the next slide, but I'll just preempt it now. Like, let's suppose Mary takes John into the doctor, Tim, into the doctor to get tested, and the doctors just look and say, "Oh yeah, these are the brain states from John's medical records. What's the problem?" Right? Well, the problem is if brain states are a sufficient explanation, then if it's an all and only thing, then something is wrong, right? Because what's going on is you have a Gettier case from the perspective of the doctors. They have a justification for their belief that Tim and John are the same person. But their justification is wrong, it turns out, and could have been undermined. And so the brain charts in front of them aren't enough. But in Mary's case, without the brain charts in front of her, she had enough. And so, like, the best way of putting this is something like there's what it is like to be X, then there is what it is to be X in the first thought experiment. And this is what I'm going to coin what it is like to know X the person. So there's a what it is like to know John that Mary has, the doctors don't have. And that what it is like to know John is giving Mary information the doctors could never have had, which would make them think their justifications being undermined by government, communications, fiddling with results. And so this, to my mind, gives me a completely different class about like brain states and brains and things like that. There are these extra what it is like to know somebody facts that could only be reduced to physics in a post hoc sense, where it's just like, okay, yeah, there's this person, they have brains, they have all the stuff, but it's not the brain stuff that's giving us the knowledge of what it's like to know them. We have it before we'd see anything about their brains, or maybe never do so long as we live. And that seems to be doing a lot of work here. And in the case of the brain stuff can actually confuse people who wouldn't be confused if they never looked at the brain stuff at all. It is really the point of the thought experiment.
So I think what you're trying to get at here is one, experience is a form of knowledge, because presumably you chose a married couple, but you could also choose, say, like soldiers from the battlefield.
Yeah.
Serve together. They have this, like, if you were to clone, say, the guy's battle brother and then swap him out, he'd know the difference immediately. He'd be like, that's not the guy that I fought with in the trenches.
Yep.
And that's, again, from experience. Now, rather than a mere description of mental states or physical states. But then the other thing is the idea that itself doesn't neatly experience as a form of knowledge, doesn't neatly fit into a reductive physicalist framework, because it has a difficulty accounting for it. Do we still have you, Logos?
Yeah, what's up?
No, did you agree with that assessment?
Oh, I'm sorry. I heard something about Battlefield and Clone, and then I slipped out a second. Can you say that again?
Right. So that person just, I only brought that up as another corollary example to your Mary and John.
Mm-hmm.
But what I was saying is that means that experience is a kind of knowledge rather than just bare description of mental or physical states. But then the other problem is a reductive physicalist doesn't have an easy way of describing experiential knowledge within their framework.
Yeah, it's kind of like, the best way I can put it is something like this. Yeah, the best way I can put it is something like this. How do I want to put this? Okay, so you have this link between brain states and what's supposed to be said about them, and that's supposed to be like a sufficient explanation or knowledge or whatever, right? Sorry, I'm getting foggy here for a second. You have this link between like information about physical facts and brain states and like mental states and all this stuff, and then the goal of like physicalism is to kind of like reduce, supplant, in some ways, kind of move things about. So anything you could say about this, you could also say in terms of those. And the point here is just to say that trying to reduce things in terms of those, given you might appreciate this because of all your talk about like technique and the machine processes and stuff like that, as you appeal more and more to the machine process for kind of reducing things down to these facts, you rely on more and more sophisticated levels of technology, analysis, and the like to do it for you. So Mary has to go to the doctor to get Tim tested to see if he's John. Well, he's going to go into machines that she doesn't really know how to use or understand. to get results that she doesn't really may not even know how to read, from doctors who know how to use the machines, maybe know how to use the results, but may not even be aware that the government can like hijack the results and substitute the results in their own in the data stream and get them in first, so they don't know everything. As the more layers you have between like you and the thing you're directly observing, the more you're kind of like outsourcing your information. And that's something that's kind of apparent in this one. That'll be more apparent in Thought Experiment 4.
Okay, but I think that's probably all the thought experiments we have for today, though.
Oh, definitely. Yeah.
So just a little brief interaction with the chat, because I have some questions about your thought experiments, Logos.
Sure.
So Minoan says, if a set of this is back to Mary and Dan.
Sure.
If a set of chemicals do antidepressants or any other drug working on brain chemistry create a new person or kill the old?
It's a good question. I don't know.
Because he says, or have I misunderstood this? I'm a little confused.
No. That's actually a really good question. That's a really good question.
That's okay. Yeah. Good. Right, because you're trying to get people to think about this, and that's
exactly.
Well,
yeah.
And this keeps going, right? This keeps going. So record deepness says that Minoan depends on your point of view. For me, there is always one and only one person no matter the brain state. Grandma isn't a new woman just because she gets Alzheimer's.
Right.
Record deepness. If I understand right, these experiments are meant to address the physicalist belief that there's nothing beyond the physical reactions in the brain, ergo different state, different person. Is that correct?
Kind of. It's more subtle. They're just meant to address the idea that it is sufficient to just talk about the brain states when talking about the person. The much more strict ontological question can be put off to the side for the second, but at the very least, semantically, when you look at the aboutness of brain states versus the aboutness of the person, there seems to be a mismatch there. And that's why I like to stress these things like what it is like to be, what it is like to be like, what it is like to know. These are kind of like aboutness propositions are kind of like orbiting this idea of brains and whatnot and minds and so on, that it doesn't look like the physics can help us penetrate. And so there's like a lack of sufficiency there.
Right. All right. Well, I think that's all we have for today. Thank you, Logos. We got through 2 of your thought experiments already. That's great.
Cool. Yeah, it was lots of fun. Hopefully I'll be a little less foggy next time. I don't know why I started hazing out a little bit at the end there. I was losing my train of thought all over the place. But the next 2 thought experiments are short and easy. And so maybe we can discuss all of them at once. We'll probably have a good 10, 15 minutes to just talk about all of them at once and kind of draw conclusions. And I don't know, hope everybody will have fun.
Yeah, I hope so too. So everybody, thanks for tuning in. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Flight podcast, signing off.